Welcome, everybody, to the 125th Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. I'm Jeff Letterman. I work in Fish and Wildlife. I'm an outdoor education specialist and coordinator for Fish and Wildlife. And today, I'm really excited that we're going to be talking about cattails. There's been a ton of information and news, I know, the last few years about cattails and the impacts that they have on our environment and our ecosystems. And we're really excited to have with us today Amy Schrank. She's an extension educator with the University of Minnesota and an expert on cattails. So welcome, Amy. We're really excited to have you here with us today.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I'm really excited to be here today. And as Jeff said, I'm going to be talking to you about cattails. Are they friend or are they foe? As Jeff said, my name's Amy Schrank. I'm the Extension Program Leader and a Fisheries and Aquaculture Extension Educator with the University of Minnesota Sea Grant. And I'm going to talk to you about cattail and some of the work we're doing on a project on cattail. And my co-author on that work is Dan Larkin. He's a professor at the U of M. And we have two grad students working on this project as well, who you'll see some pictures of in a minute. And the funders of our project are the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center through the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. So what I want to start with today is what a healthy nearshore lake ecosystem should look like in Minnesota. So that's this picture. So we're going to do a little primer about that to start. And what I want you to notice about this picture is all the variety of plants you see. So you see some cattail. You can see those little puffy tufts in the foreground. You can see a couple of researchers here. You see the lake, and when you look in the background, you see this brown-topped plant in the emergent zone. This plant is a bulrush. There are lots of different species of bulrush. And when I say emergent zone, I mean a plant that is rooted underwater, so in the sediment underwater, and emerges out of the water to grow. So I'm sure all of you have seen something like a bulrush. And these are really important emergent plants in Minnesota lakes. As we move out a little deeper, you can see some floating leaf plants, probably lily pads, and there's likely some submerged plants in there as well. So lots of different species with lots of different physical shapes. So that's what I want you to take away from this picture. If we move down and take a closer, what I call frog's eye view here of this type of a landscape, you can see these bulrushes sticking up. You can see a lot of floating leaf plants mixed in. So these plants are all mixed together. There's a lot of space. These plants are sharing space. These floating leaf plants provide protection from predators. So if fish are living below them, they're protected from bird predators. And it provides a lot of habitat for things like macroinvertebrates or bugs or crayfish or frogs to live in. If we move down into a fisheye view, we can see that these very narrow stems of bulrush allow protection from predators, so from fish predators for fishes, but a lot of space for fish to swim through. So it's not so dense that fish can't swim through it. And then if you look at the bottom corner picture here, you see lots of submergent plants. Again, those leaves provide predator protection for fishes and a lot of habitat habitat for food, fish food, things like macroinvertebrates, crayfish, other species. So this is the picture I want to give you of a healthy nearshore ecosystem. Lots of different types of plants with different physical forms, emergent, floating, submerged, all sort of sharing space together. So that's the basic idea. These nearshore zones in our lakes are really critical for a lot of reasons. I should disclose that I'm a fisheries biologist by background, so there is a fish bias to this presentation, and we were interested in how cattails affect fishes. So I'll be talking about fishes quite a bit. And in terms of fishes, these nearshore zones are really important spawning and nursery areas for many species. So you see an example here. This is a small stickleback. You can see she's ready to deposit her eggs. We see a couple of larval fish here. So many species of babies grow up in these nearshore zones. And some of our familiar game fishes, this is a northern pike, they're really dependent on these vegetated nearshore areas to grow up and to have good nursery habitat. So in addition to spawning in nursery areas, these nearshore vegetated zones provide homes for fish that spend their whole lives there. So these are 4 different species of minnows, and these are really important as forage fish for some of the larger game species that humans tend to care more about. I personally love minnows and looking at different minnow species, but probably these larger fish are the ones more humans are are interested in. So many of these species feed predominantly on these minnows that depend on the habitat in the nearshore zone. So these zones, hopefully I've convinced you, are super critical to have not only healthy fish communities in our lakes, but bird communities, amphibian communities, and many other things. So what's happening with cattail and how is this relevant? So cattail, and I'll talk about what species of cattail in a minute, has been slowly taking over many nearshore zones, not only in Minnesota, but in the Great Lakes region. So rather than those first few pictures of diverse vegetated zones, we end up with this quite homogeneous region dominated primarily about very thick and very dense cattail. And it's really this homogenization or making everything the same that causes problems in our nearshore zones. So I want to back up and talk about cattail. What cattail am I talking about? Is it invasive? Is it native? So this is my quick cattail primer for those of you who may not know the different species. We do have a native cattail. It's called a broadleaf cattail. If you're interested in a scientific name, it's Typha latifolia. And we also have a non-native or invasive cattail called narrowleaf cattail, Typha angustifolia, probably came from Europe, probably before sometime in the early 1800s, and I'll talk about that timeline in a second. And what people often wonder right off the bat is, okay, so how do I tell these apart? So I'm going to go over that briefly. So for broadleaf cattail, the name indicates its leaves are relatively broad. This is a very difficult characteristic to figure out when you're just looking at one cattail plant. You know, it's hard to know if it's broadleafed unless you have a narrowleaf cattail to compare it to. But one other characteristic is you can look at the flowering parts of the plant. So this top part is the male part of the plant, the brown part's the female part of the plant. In the spring and summer, so right now, if you have a cattail near you, you can see this. The male and the female part touch or nearly touch in the native cattail. So that's a good indication. And then if we look at the invasive cattail or the hybrid, the non-native cattail, you can see that the leaf is narrower. Again, this is not super reliable unless you're comparing it to a broadleaf cattail. And one of the other major characteristics is that the male, which is the top part, and the female bottom part of the flowering plant are separate. You can also see that there's some other size differences, but these are the two main characteristics. So you can see there's a big space here. So you might think to yourself, oh, great, this is super easy to tell apart. The complication arises because wherever you have these two species in proximity, so near each other, they always reproduce together. So that's called hybridization. So they produce yet another cattail that's a hybrid. We call that hybrid cattail. The scientific name is Typha X glauca to indicate that it's a hybrid. And its characteristics are, of course, intermediate. So it makes it kind of hard to tell these apart from either of their parent species. Most commonly, when they hybridize, we have this hybrid cattail, and I'll tell you why in a minute. If you look at the spacing again between the male and female part of the plant, you can see there's a little, sometimes there's none, sometimes there's a lot. This species does grow differently. So when you have a big, broad, expansive cattail, I always suggest to people to look at multiple stems because sometimes you see some have space, some don't have space. And what happens is these plants are back crossing with each other frequently. And I'm not going to talk any more about that except for to say it causes a lot of variation in the way the plant looks. But it's this hybrid cattail that tends to grow in this more quote unquote aggressive, if you can ascribe being aggressive to a plant, compared to either of its parent species. So when I'm talking about this cattail for the rest of my presentation, I'm really referring to this hybrid cattail. So where did it come from and why the heck is it here? So I really like this map. It's a little bit of an older map from 1999 from Sue Galadowicz, who's a professor at the U of M. And it shows you the range of Typha X glauca, which remembers the hybrid cattail. So if we look at the key here, we look at this dark dot that's 1860, and we look at this dark line along the eastern seaboard, what that indicates is that that's the only place Typha X glauca was found at that time. And they can tell this because you can dig into soil and look at the pollen grains and construct what was historically there. That is not a thing I do as a fish biologist, but you can be pretty confident about where and when not only Typha, but different species of plants were around. So they're pretty confident that this was around just along the coast in 1860. Now, if we look at this checkerboard sort of lobe that comes in, this red star represents Minnesota. You can see that as we sort of opened up these waterways throughout the Great Lakes, hybrid cattail likely followed. So it's been in Minnesota since at least 1949. And then if we look at this sort of diagonal crosshatching, you can see the expanse at about 1967. This map says This is current, but as I said, it's a bit of an older map. So if you look at more updated range maps, it's now all across the US and continuing to spread into Canada. So it makes it a little bit of a cryptic invader. It's been here so long, since before, some of us, but not all of us were born. We kind of think of it as belonging here, even though maybe it doesn't. So I think that's what causes some of the confusion about hybrid cattail. So I wanted to show you a couple of aerial photos just to show you sort of what happens with hybrid cattail and how it takes over. So this is an older aerial photo from 1972 that's showing you Jackfish Bay. So this is in Rainy Lake. And these kind of grayish blobs are islands, and the black is water. It's Rainy Lake. And what you can see is these islands were connected by these roads. And at the time, they weren't super careful about making culverts on the under the roads or ensuring that that water flow continues around these islands. So you can see what it looks like now. You can see there's not a lot of vegetation growth in between these islands, but you can see there's quite a bit of development. So now I'm going to show you a picture from 2020. Same place, it's a little blurry. It's from Google Earth. And what you can see is this brown stuff growing in between these islands, especially where there are these causeways connecting islands. And that is all hybrid cattail. So that's just slowly filled in over time. And that's happened in a lot of our lakes. This is just a nice example because we have a couple of good aerial photos. Incidentally, they have been working to remove some of this cattail in these areas to try and reclaim some of the lake back. But this is happening not only in Rainy Lake, but other regions as well. So we know what it is. Why is it doing what it's doing? So again, just a brief background on cattail biology. So cattail reproduced using wind dispersed seeds. So you probably have seen this, those brown sort of catkins have the seeds in the fall, those fly away and they can establish new cattail populations elsewhere. This is not uncommon. Many wetland plants reproduce this way. They can also reproduce clonally via a rhizome. So the rhizome is this kind of ropey root that connects these stems. This is a kind of a portion of a cattail plant we ripped up and laid out on the road. And so if this rhizome gets cut, for example, here at the arrow, this plant can like shoot another root out and establish another stem in another spot. So they're able to reproduce clonally. And again, this is not special to cattail. Many other wetland plants do this as well. But when we talk about creating clones, that's what's happening. It's just one plant that's sending up different roots in different places. So why if everybody does this, if every other wetland plant does this, including other species of typha or cattail, why is it that the hybrid cattail takes over? And the reason people sort of attribute this to is hybrid vigor or what's called heterosis. And this is the idea that the offspring of two parents are just better off, more fit, better able to handle the environment. So I have this corn here because it's kind of a good example. You have parent one and parent two. These parents reproduce together and you get a bigger ear of corn. That's sort of exactly what's happening with hybrid cattail. So when we talk about the cattail that's a problem in our lakes and wetlands, it's this hybrid that is really taking over. It's not our native broadleaf cattail, and it really isn't that invasive narrowleaf cattail. It's this hybrid that sort of goes crazy and takes over everything. So what does it actually do, and what are the consequences? So hybrid cattail relative to the other to its parents has a very rapid growth rate, so it grows really fast, and it grows very tall. So you can see that in this top picture. This is taken in northern Lake Huron, actually. In the foreground, these sort of light green plants are other different types of species of sedges, so native wetland plants. And you can see the dark green, this is hybrid cattail. You can see how much taller it is, and it's usually over 6 feet tall in the summer. If you've ever walked through a cattail stand, you can actually get lost. You can't see over the top of it, and it's very dense. So it grows taller, it forms larger clones, so it expands out in a greater area than does either of its parents. Consequently, it has more biomass accumulation. So biomass just means plant material. So it can be live plant material, or what really is a problem is dead plant material or litter. So this live cattail is so bushy and green, as soon as it dies, it just smooshes down, and that sort of smushing down continues to suppress other native plants. So the litter, we call it cattail litter, is a really big problem as well and causes some of the bad effects we see from cattail. It's tolerant of a wide range of water levels. We, as you probably know, we manipulate water levels all the time in our lakes in Minnesota and other parts of the Great Lakes region. And when we do that, cattail are happy. So I realize I'm sometimes saying typha. That also means cattail. So apologies if I mix those two words together, but you know what they both mean. So when we change water levels, cattail are happy, hybrid cattail. It also prefers nutrient-rich systems. So when we add a lot of fertilizer to our lawns and don't have any vegetation near the edge of the lake to take those nutrients up, then we're adding nutrients to the system, and cattail are happy about that. Agricultural nutrients, if our septic systems aren't working that well, anytime we're adding nutrients to water, we're benefiting these invasive cattail. And they're also pretty tolerant of salt. So as you know, we put a lot of salt on our roads in Minnesota, and this does have negative effects for some plants, but doesn't seem to negatively affect hybrid cattail too much. So some characteristics there. So let's get back to what's happening with water and maybe talk a little bit more about fish. So we've done some background research, particularly in Lake Huron, looking at what happens when, how you can compare an uninvaded nearshore zone, so what is sort of a native looking nearshore zone, you can see the plants here, to a cattail invaded nearshore zone. And based on some of this past research, we found some characteristics of an invasive, of an area that's been invaded by cattails. So we see reduced dissolved oxygen in the water column, and I'm going to talk about oxygen in a minute. We see reduced plant diversity, so meaning there's not as many different types of plants as there are in an uninvaded zone. We see reduced fish abundance. That just means there's not as many fish, individual fish, as there are in the uninvaded zone. And we also see a reduction in fish diversity. So not only do we see fewer fishes, but we see fewer species of fishes in these cattail invaded areas. So again, this is from a study in Lake Huron. We don't know a lot about this in Minnesota, so one of our goals is to figure out how cattail affect lakes in Minnesota as well. So knowing this background information, one of the things we wanted to understand is that how can hybrid cattail management, how can we manage this hybrid cattail to help mitigate some of these negative effects that we see when cattail invade? So that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time here. A little background on management. What can we do, right? What are our options? We can use herbicide. So, and we do that. This is an example of spraying herbicide in, I think, some wetlands in Minnesota. Herbicide is not great in lakes or aquatic systems because it really negatively affects especially larval fishes, so the baby fishes, and also amphibians. Amphibians have very thin skin, so they're very sensitive to herbicide. People burn cattail regularly. This can be a good option because it reduces that biomass, right? You don't have to deal with all that dead cattail litter because that can be a problem. But burning also has some negative effects on lakes and organisms that live in lakes, and it's hard to do when you have a really densely populated lakes. You don't necessarily want to be burning near people's docks or houses. People mow it, and you would have to do this every year. And then another option is to cut it below the water. And cutting it below the water is the option we're looking at in our research. And the reason for that is during some past research in the Great Lakes region, we cut some channels through cattail to sort of see what happened with fish communities, plant communities, and environmental variables. And what we noticed, and you can tell this is pretty hard work, these people are sweaty. What you notice when you cut cattail below the water, so you're cutting the stem basically underwater. You're not disturbing the sediment, but you're cutting the stem underwater. When you come back to these sites in 1 or 2 seasons, you see that native plants are growing back. So it turns out that native plants have a very resilient seeds, and those seeds stay in the sediment. You can imagine that makes sense, right? Water levels vary, so seeds can hold in the sediment over years when it's too dry for them to grow. And so what we think is happening here is we're removing that competing cattail, right? We're giving those seeds light and space, and when we do that, those plants grow back without us trying to reseed them. So we were interested in using this as a test. One aside into more cattail biology, because I can't help myself. This is a really cool thing about cattail and also wetland plants. The reason this works is when you cut the cattail below the stem, you're drowning that individual stem. You're not killing the entire plant, but you're drowning that individual stem. And the reason you're doing that is because these plants are really specialized. This is a cross section of a cattail stem. So like if you take the stem and just cut it and look down it, this is true for other wetland plants as well. They have to, because they're rooted under the water, they have to conduct oxygen from the top of the plant to the bottom of the plant. And they do this through these holes in their stem. These are called arenchyma. May or may not care about the name, but it's a pretty cool feature of wetland plants. So when you kind of flood these arenchyma or holes in their stem, that stem can't regrow. But as you'll see in a little bit, if the water subsides and those cut stems are out of water, they can regrow. So water level is a really important factor here, which you'll see in a little bit. So if we zoom out and say we're flying over lakes in Minnesota, you see that we create these kinds of channels all the time. So we're already doing this to get our boat into the, into the open water for swimming, for any way we want to access our lake. So we're already doing this. And so what we were interested in is how does this mechanical harvesting, removal of hybrid cattail affect nearshore plant and fish communities? Are we doing something that could be beneficial, and how can we harness this? So I'm going to talk in particular now about sort of the research questions we have and how we're going about answering them, and what we found, because we're kind of in the process of wrapping up the first phase of our study. So our specific questions that I'm going to talk about now are, does cattail removal increase plant diversity and benefit water quality and fish communities in nearshore lake ecosystems? And also, how does this vary across regions? So we can imagine in the north, where there's lots of native seeds still in the sediment, maybe plants will regrow, but maybe in southern lakes where there's only cattail, you remove the cattail and you end up with a ton of shoreline erosion, right? There are ecosystem benefits of cattail in the absence of other plants. So we just wanted to make sure we were taking that regional difference into account. A note here, in terms of what is allowed, because from the Minnesota DNR, currently you can apply for an aquatic plant management permit that allows you to remove vegetation in a 15-foot wide swath from shore to open water. So we've used this as a guide for how wide our study sites are, and we've doubled this. So our study sites, which you'll see in a minute, are 30 feet. So where did we do our work? We chose 9 lakes in Minnesota, and this is roughly where they are. And if you're interested, here's the list. Our more northern lakes are Rainy and Lake Kabetogama. And then we went as far south as Coon Lake and Big Marine. So just a guideline of where we did our work. And what we did at each site was, within a dense stand of cattail, we chose 2 plots, a control plot or a control site where we did not remove cattail, and then a second site where we remove cattail. So this is pretty straightforward. It's either removed or not removed. And this little picture shows you an overhead view. This is a photo from Big Marine Lake, one of our study sites, and you can see our researchers out here, and a bunch of cattail in the distance. So I'm going to give you a timeline here. In 2021, we chose our sites. We did not remove cattail yet. We went to these sites and measured water quality plants and fish before removal. So you can see my little schematic. These are our 2 sites, but cattail's still there. In the fall of 2021, we contracted with a company to remove cattails, and you can see what our removal looks like, and I'll show you some more pictures in a second. And then in summer 2022, we went back and measured water quality plants and fish post cattail removal. So you can see that cattail are removed there. So we're just trying to see what happens before and after. This is just some photos of our cattail removal. We had plans to use sort of a boat with a cutter bar, but it turns out they had to do a lot of it by hand. So you can just see some pictures of what those removals look like. And as I said, it's 30 feet wide, doubling the current permitted width for aquatic plant removal. I have to pause and say, acknowledge the 2 graduate students and summer researchers that worked on this project. So you have Brendan Nee here working on the clipboard, Mike Tuma behind the cattail. Brendan worked on fishes, Mike worked on plants. These 2 were out in the really dense cattail, which can be beautiful and can also be terrible depending on the weather and depending on how dense the cattail is. They did all the hard work, and you can envision them right now sitting in the lab crunching data, because that's where we are with this project. But it would not happen without the 2 of them. And we had 2 excellent summer field technicians from University of Minnesota Duluth, Kaylin and Dylan. I love this picture because they did not work the same summer, and these pictures were taken a year apart, yet they're doing the exact same thing, which is recording data while Mike is talking about plants. So thank you to my research crew, who was totally awesome. All right, so now I don't want you to be scared, but I'm going to show you a couple data slides, and I promise it's not complicated. I want to show you what we found. Our data are still in process, but we have some initial findings. So what I want to first talk about is oxygen. So this data shows you dissolved oxygen on the y-axis, so how much is in the water, and time on the x-axis, so 8 a.m., 9 a.m., all the way up to 1300, which is 1 p.m. And I'm going to show you some dots that are blue in our cattail retained sites where we still had cattail, and orange in our cattail removed sites. So these are after we remove cattail. You can see the little schematic diagram in the corner. And what I want you to just notice here is how most of these orange dots are above the blue dots, right? And what that's telling us is that there's more dissolved oxygen in these cattail removed sites compared to cattail retained sites. So as we suspected, we're seeing more oxygen getting in to these areas where we've removed cattail compared to where we've retained cattail. And I'm going to jump to another aside here to explain why this happens, because I think this is really important. Fish require oxygen, and when you have too low of oxygen, you'll lose some fish species. So this is my little primer on dissolved oxygen, just so you can understand how it works in a nearshore system if you don't already. So we have dissolved oxygen in the water on the y-axis, and you can see it's just time of day on the x-axis, right? Dawn, daytime, oxygen goes up. At night, it turns around and comes down. So the reason for this, and if I was talking to you in person, I would say, who knows why this happens? So what happens during the day is that you have sunlight, so you have a lot of photosynthesis occurring, and that increases oxygen in the water all day. And then at night, and I forgot I have these pictures. So who does that? Algae, right? Creates oxygen, and so do plants. At night, you have a lot of respiration happening. Things are breathing, decomposition's happening, and that uses up oxygen. So oxygen declines at night. And the result of that is in early morning, in any system, whether it's a wetland or a near shore vegetated zone of a lake, you have these glows of oxygen in the morning. And that's normal, that happens. What we suspect cattail is causing is in the morning, when you have low oxygen, in these nearshore zones, you still have oxygen-rich water out here in the main part of the lake, for example. And as with wind and waves, that flows into these interior zones. And if you have a sort of more open native plant community here, water can really get into these interiors. But when you have really dense cattail, that water can't get through. And so we suspect that oxygen just lags in those cattail systems. It has to wait for photosynthesis to get going. Consequently, these are always lower than a native or cattail removed zone. So that's the mechanics of what's happening, we think, with oxygen and cattail. And it has important ramifications for fishes. So we also found that vegetation returned. So we removed these cattail and we found in those sites, vegetation came back, right? We see here a study quadrat. We're looking down onto it and we can see some water shield and some other pond weeds starting to grow even in the first summer. And here's Mike looking at some plants and you can see around him in this cattail cut that plants are growing back once we've given them space. So this is great. Remember, we didn't reseed, so that's called passive revegetation. Plants are just growing without us doing anything except for removing cattail. So this was a good sign for us. And what about the fishes? We sample fish with minnow traps. It's really hard to sample fishes in a very dense cattail stand. So when I talk about fish, I'm talking about small ones, right? This is a little baby bluegill green sunfish hybrid. It's hard to tell, but they're small fish that we're talking about here. And I'm going to show you one fish graph. And I'm going to show you a fish graph about minnows, and I'm going to explain to you why that's important in a minute. So we have average minnow abundance here. So it's basically, you can see these numbers are pretty small, but we're looking at a few minnows to a lot of minnows. And you can see my schematic in the corner here. I'm going to show you the sites where we retained cattail in orange and sites where we removed cattail in blue. And remember, we did this over 2 years. So, and remember, cattail were removed here, right, between 2021 and 2022. So in 2021, we saw about the same number of minnows in plots. Now this is across 9 lake sites, right? We only found 11 minnows in our retained sites and 14 in our removed sites. Remember, these removed sites still had cattail in them. And so when we look at 2022 data, we only saw 1 minnow in our retained and 26 minnows in our removed sites, again, across all of our lakes. So this indicates to us that when you open up space for minnows, especially in these nearshore zones, they will move in when those cattails are gone. So remember this, I'll talk about this in a second. So an overall summary of what we've found so far is that with mechanical removal of hybrid cattail, we see increased dissolved oxygen, more native plants, a better fish community, in particular more minnows. Why do we care about minnows, right? I mean, I like minnows, but I'm a fish biologist. So one of the important things, you know, we see minnows, but we see really a lot of these fishes in these cattail zones. So baby bluegills and pumpkin seeds and largemouth bass and rock bass and mud minnows. But if we're thinking about game fishes like walleye and others, scientists who study fish diet find out that these game fishes eat minnows. They do not eat as commonly these other species. These other species are hiding in the weeds. These minnows are more out in the open or on the edge of the vegetation. So if we're losing minnow species as cattails encroach, this can propagate through the food web and can be a problem for game fishes we care more about. So something important there. So I want to wrap up and leave time for questions. In terms of impacts, Fishes and plants generally seem to increase with cattail removal, we're finding. We see more minnows in cattail removed plots, as I said. Data suggests that removing cattail in this mechanical way is effective, but water level is super important. And I'm going to show you an example here from one of our sites at Voyageurs National Park. Obviously, this is fall. We removed cattail a while ago in this photo, but you can see that the water level has gone down, and with that, cattails are still shooting up some of these stems. These are our temperature loggers that are supposed to be underwater. So water level makes a huge difference. So that's a big important thing to consider. I'm supposed to say thanks to Voyageurs National Park here. They did all the cattail removal in Rainy and Lake Cabotogama. So they were super helpful with this project as well. We are also working with the DNR to help inform landowner permitting decisions. They're a partner with us on this project. They help us select sites. We collaborate with them regularly. So we're talking to them about what this could mean in terms of policy. And lastly, public outreach is super important. So I do not want to leave you with the impression that everyone should just go ahead and rip out all their cattail, because that's really not the important thing. The important thing is we need to restore native plants. Remember back to the beginning, it's that diversity of physical forms of plants and species of plants that's really important. So rather than focusing on just like get rid of all our cattail, it's like let's restore these nearshore ecosystems with the native plants that are supposed to be there to support our fish community. These are a couple of photos of a field event we did at Big Marine Lake talking to folks about cattail and some of the species we find in minnow traps. This is Brendan giving a field lecture. We invited everyone out on a bunch of boats and talked about our sites and what we can take away from that. So important public outreach component. We did get funded for a phase 2 of this project, which is super exciting. So thanks to MASERC and the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. Our plans in the future, this is going to be a 2-year project, is to monitor cattail regrowth, right? How's that going to work? What maintenance is going to be required to sustain these openings? We want to get a better sense of fish using these cattail openings, not just tiny fish, but some bigger fish as well. And we want to add a new site. So, you know, we had cattail retained and cattail removed. We'd like to study a native site along with that to compare, you know, when we remove cattail, are we like returning these sites to a native state? We don't know. Lastly, there's always the question for me about muskrats. This occurred in Lake Huron. This is Hannah, one of our technicians. Every time we opened up cattail, we'd see a muskrat mound. I think it would be really interesting to study the relationship between muskrats and hybrid cattail. It's not going to happen in the next 2 years, but maybe someday. With that, thanks for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions. You are also free to contact me through my email, and I know folks are putting some links in the chat, so you can go find some more information. And lastly, want to thank our funders again, MASERC and the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, and our partners, Voyageurs National Park and Minnesota DNR. So thanks.
Thanks, Amy. It's really great information, and I'm really excited about your research, and thank you for doing this and pulling all this together and sharing that with us today. We do have a couple of questions that have come in already, but if other folks have some, please put those in the Q&A. And then Benji and Cassie just put up the polling. We have a couple of questions. You've got a few minutes if you want to take the polls that are also, you can find those in under the ellipsis if it's not showing up on the right-hand side. So check those out. We'll start with the first question here from Jenny. Does the removal area become an area for carp to congregate and stir up sediment?
That's a good question. We have not seen that. We have not seen that happen. It's interesting. I was just going through the species list of fishes that we had in all of our sites, and we did not come up with carp. Now we're using minnow traps. So that would be something that we would love to keep an eye on later in future studies, but it doesn't seem to be that way now, but it's definitely a possibility and something to watch out for.
Great. Siona, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, asked, do you have any management advice for private landowners who have ponds, wetlands on their property? Should we remove portions of hybrid cattails once a year, and do we need to reintroduce native plants in these cleared areas?
Our data suggests that it is a good idea to remove. You need to, of course, go through Minnesota DNR, right? They have the permit that you would need to get to remove hybrid cattail. I think it would be really interesting to remove cattail in the sort of permitted area and just sort of see what happens, right? In a lot of cases, we're removing cattail with a permit to put our boats in and out or to access a lake. But I think it would be interesting to get a permit just to look at what happens with native plant restoration. We are, as I said, just letting native plants grow back. There's also a lot of work in Voyageurs National Park They actually have a video about it that I could probably find a link to. They are removing a lot of cattail there and then reseeding that area with a native plant mix. So their anecdotal data suggests that is something that can work as well. So as long as you go through the permitting process, I think it is worthwhile to remove it a little bit and see if native plants are going to return.
And do you know what the process is for that to get the permits and the costs
Yeah,
and stuff like that?
yep. You're going to have to go. I don't quote me on the cost because I should have looked right before this, but I didn't. So there, you can actually do it through the Minnesota DNR website. It's and you can go through aquatic plant management. There's a permitting process you can go through online. So you prepare your information, you submit the site, the location, where you want to do it, how you want to remove it. My recollection is about $35. And then what happens is you will be contacted and they'll come out and look at your site, make sure everything's okay, there's nothing weird going on, and either approve or not approve your permit. We went through the process through DNR with our removals as well, and it's not particularly onerous to do online. It's pretty easy to find, and it's not a terribly difficult process, and DNR is pretty quick about it. So
Yeah, and maybe Benji or Cassie could throw up a link to that site if they could find it. Paul asked a really good question. I'm a long-term waterfowl hunter too, and we talked about this in the practice about the impacts on waterfowl. And he asked, is there any studies of how cattail removal has impacted waterfowl and migratory birds? And
yep.
if not, any thoughts?
Yeah, there are some studies. I am not a bird person, so but one of the studies I was part of in the Great Lakes region, we were looking at all types of different species. And again, um, when we talk about removal, we're sort of talking about partial removal, right? It's not like we're removing the entire thing, but making these openings. One of the really big problems for cattail and things like secretive marsh birds or wading birds is that they can't get into that dense cattail. And I assume a lot of that applies to waterfowl as well. That area is closed to them because it's so dense. So when you start adding these openings, I think you provide areas for waterfowl and other birds to use those habitats, because what happens is they can't access food there anymore. So they stop using them. There are birds that like it, right? A red-winged blackbird will use a cattail stand happily, marsh wrens as well. But there have been some studies about birds and I don't know if there are studies particularly about waterfowl. I know there are folks working on that now, but it's a good question. Cattail invasion does seem to have some negative effects, and these small scale removals seem to be beneficial.
Great. We covered, Deb asked about permits. I think Benji threw up that link, so check that out. Elizabeth asked, do you get any blowback from people who don't want you to remove the cattails?
Not necessarily. I think generally, people want to remove cattails because it can impede recreational access to lakes. I think there is concern, and rightfully so, from management agencies that, if you say this is a good idea, then people will willy-nilly want to rip out all their cattail. And that's, we want to make sure that we're not saying that. We're saying you want to remove cattail for plant restoration. But I've actually and I've talked about this in Minnesota for about 2 years now. I've never encountered anyone who's like, oh, I really want to keep my cattail, because mostly it's a problem when it's so dense that it really impedes a lot of things, views, recreation, etc. But again, emphasis on the restoration of native plants, those water lilies and submerged aquatic vegetation, which as a kid I called seaweed, super important, right? So it's restoration, that's important.
Doug had a really good question, and typically a lot of hybrids of plants, cultivated hybrids, are infertile. And he'd heard that about hybrid cattails, that they were sterile and could only spread vegetatively. Is that true?
That's a good question. And before I say yes, that's absolutely true, I would do more research. But they do back cross, so I know there's some reproduction occurring there. And it's certainly their sterility has not impeded their effect as an invasive species. So that's a good question biologically, and I don't know the definitive answer, but I know there is back crossing that occurs, so there is some reproduction that's occurring.
And of course, as you mentioned, they can clone and spread through rhizomes too.
Yeah,
Once they get
they
going.
clone and spread, and that's enough for them to get a really good foothold. And yeah, interestingly, I'm kind of veering off here. There are some folks that think that it's possible that, the native cattail will be really reduced in abundance, because if you always have that reproduction possibility when both of those species are present, could it be that that hybrid will eventually outcompete native cattail wherever it is? So that's, I think, an interesting question. I don't think anyone's really done any research about that, but I think should be something of concern.
Here's a question from Justine, which is one we talked about earlier too, but in our practice, but I'm not prepared to answer it from the DNR perspective, but you might have an opinion. Is the DNR receptive to changing their current policy to allow for 30-foot wide plus swaths of cattail to control it, or for control? And and then she has another follow-up question I'll ask.
Yeah, DNR is very interested in this work. So, DNR really wants evidence-based changes to policy, right? If policy is going to be changed, you want to have some data to back that up, and you want to be able to enforce policy equally, right? So yes, they are receptive in that they've been very supportive of this project. We were very collaborative when we started, and they worked with us. Shane McBride from Aquatic Plant Management was involved in this project in the beginning and will continue to be involved on subsequent projects. So yes, very receptive. Policy change is beyond my purview, right? That is an organism that's within the DNR, and so yes, they're receptive to hearing the data we are providing, and I think they want some data so that they can make informed policy decisions, and so that's our goal, is to provide data to allow them to make informed policy decisions. I think there are some creative ways you could go about this. You could have a sort of, but of course, I don't think of enforcement, right? I think pie in the sky. Like, it'd be really cool if you could have some, habitat restoration, plots that you could give people. But then you have to make sure those people aren't trampling those plots later. And how do you handle that? So I think there's a lot of policy considerations that the DNR thinks about that, for us sort of sciencey people, we don't always know to go there. So, but they're definitely receptive.
And I first heard you talk to our DNR fisheries group, which there was a very large number of them there, and I know they were really excited and interested in your research. So yeah, I know that their folks are talking about that within fisheries, because it's obvious that there's some really big impacts. And Justine, I think she asked if you're looking for additional field sites, so I think she might have some ideas.
Yeah. Feel free to get in touch with me. My email, I think folks have put my email in the chat. I'm happy to answer questions, and you can give me a call, and I'm happy to talk cattail.
Christine wanted us to clarify. She thought you could remove a path without a permit to access the lake. Is that true?
No. You need a permit. Again, I am not the DNR, but as far as I understand, you really can't remove plants unless you have a permit from the DNR.
Another related question is, how is DNR monitoring cattail removal on private property? And I do not know the answer to that, other than I know we have plant management experts, and then of course we have enforcement components of our agency also.
Yep, that would be the mechanism. Aquatic plant management, one of the real benefits for us of working with DNR is that they know these lakes so well. I can sit here, and I'm based in St. Paul. I can say, okay, we're going to study all these lakes, but what are the sites that are needed? They really have the on the ground knowledge. So they do that through their mechanisms, right? When you request a permit, they most often come visit, see what it's like, what does it look like? And so they know their on the ground areas pretty well. And I don't know what monitoring they do. That's not something I do know. I do know Voyagers is doing it, but I don't know the monitoring from DNR.
I was an elected official, and I can tell you one of the things that elected officials and leaders rely on is reporting from individuals and the public. So certainly I think the DNR, and we have a tip line, obviously, if there's a whole scale issue going on with things are in violation of some of our rules, we encourage you to use the turn in poachers line, but contact your local fisheries or wildlife managers or our enforcement agents to share some of those concerns, or if we know specific issues that are going on. Another good question, are there examples of commercial uses for cattails that are removed as feed or fertilizer? Or
that's a really good question. That's a very good question. And we have not looked at this in our study. It's as I was talking about when I talked, there's so much biomass. So even for us, when you're figuring out what to do with all that dead cattail, you need to figure out how to handle it. And so first, I will tell you that if you just sort of pile it on shore, what happens is all the nutrients that are there in that dead cattail are going to run right back into your lake. So there's some concerns about just leaving piles of dead vegetation around, because you're actually increasing nutrient loading to your lake. So some lakes require that you actually move that cattail out of the watershed, so you're not, causing more negative effects by increasing increasing nutrients going into the lake. People have studied like pelletizing cattail, like grinding up and pelletizing it and burning it in a pellet stove or for energy. You can use it to make biogas. So that's some of the, there are definitely some folks looking into that, and there are some uses. One of the big problems is it's expensive and difficult to truck around, right? So we initially, a few projects ago, we thought, oh, we'll remove all this cattail and we'll figure out how to digest it in a biodigester and make energy out of it, right? We could not overcome the cost it would take to get a huge truck to pick up all this biomass and take it to the digester facility. So that's a complicated factor. If you have something close by that you can do, that's great. One really cool example of folks doing something with that dead cattail is, again, what Voyagers is doing. They harvest their cattail, and they're a national park, so they can do a lot of things on their, in their park that we can't do in other places. But they harvest it, and then they put it on shore and use it to smush down all the cattail that's already there. So they kind of pack it in there, and then they reseed it. So that dead cattail is sort of acting as a nutrient source for seeding native plants. And I think that's a really interesting idea. I will say that we're working closely in the second phase of our project with Big Marine Park Reserve. They're really excited about this project. We're talking about doing some more cattail removal there, and it'd be interesting to see if we can do some reseeding like Voyagers is. We haven't attempted that yet, but one of the problems is just like the expense of getting the stuff somewhere to be useful. It's kind of a long answer.
Yeah, the materials that have a lot of moisture content in them like that are very heavy, and so then you have those expenses. Emily asked about site constraints in which you work to do the mechanical removal. You kind of touched on this, but she's said that we've been advised that our lake is too shallow and the bottom is too unconsolidated to use machinery. And I guess there's a water level issue there too, right?
Yeah. Yep. So and really a lot of the lakes, we thought, oh great, these guys will just, we contracted with somebody, they come in with their boat and they do it. It turns out almost all the places we had them cut cattail, they had to just use what I call an underwater weed whacker, right? An aquatic plant removal thing by hand. So I think like if you're thinking about doing this as a landowner, yes, you can contract with somebody who might have a machine to come in, but you also can, it's also possible to do it with hand tools and an underwater weed whacker, or even just those aquatic plant management rakes, again with a permit. So yeah, it can be tricky to. It seems like a nice idea to come in with a machine, but as we found out, it doesn't always work that way. It is a lot of handwork, and so I think that's why it's important for us to keep track of, what does regrowth look like? What's it like when water level is an issue? What is the maintenance? And if you're doing this on landowner property, could you as a landowner put a big maybe time investment into doing it once, or contracting out to doing it once, and then just a little bit of maintenance work every year would maintain that opening. I think that's something would be important to know.
Jeff asked, are you aware of similar research being done in other states?
Yep, there's a lot of groups, especially in Michigan. So there's a group out of Loyola that I've worked with on some of that Great Lakes research. There's a lot of research going on in northern Lake Huron, Shiawassee Wildlife Refuge in Michigan. So yeah, there's a fair number of cattail. There's a fair number of research going on, quite a bit of research going on there, and that's out of Loyola. If you Googled cattail research Loyola, you can probably find some of that. They're loosely known as Team Taifa because Taifa is the name of cattail. So there's a lot of interesting work, and we've collaborated on projects as well. So I think Michigan's been doing a lot, and now we've started in Minnesota, and hopefully continue.
Carrie touches on something that I think is a really good point too. Oftentimes you don't see cattails in the water. They're on moister soils probably, but even what appear to be mostly dry soils. And she was also asking, in this case it's on the shoreline, but if they're out of the water, is there other, do the same restrictions apply for removal?
I don't know. I do not know that. Yeah, I'm not sure what sort of wetlandy plant removal. I would not want to speculate on that. I'm just not sure what the rule is there. What's water and what's not water. I think it would come down to what wetland rules are, and I'm just not sure.
Yeah. And again, I'm not an expert, but I do know, the protected wetlands oftentimes can be very temporary and can be dry for a big part of the year. But apparently some cattails, especially probably the hybrids, don't need a lot of water either, I guess, huh?
No, they will, it'll always be wet. Yeah, I think your point about what we call like ephemeral wetlands, right? Areas that are
Mhm.
wet sometimes, they're actually super important, disproportionately important to the environment, I think, that most people think. So yeah, if you've got cattail, it's probably wet some of the time. So yeah, it would be something to check into, what the rules are for that.
Uh, I think we've touched on this, but I don't, maybe it's not clear. If you remove cattails and you cut them, do you have to take the cattails out? Is that part of the permit requirement?
Depend
The ones that are cut.
Depends on it depends on the lake. And
Okay.
again, this is just from my experience, one of the real challenges we had was finding sites. And our sites, we did our sites always all on public land with one exception. So it really depends on the rules for the lake. Lakes have different rules. In some cases, we had to move it outside the watershed. In other cases, we didn't. They were okay for us to pile it away from the water, in the same watershed. So it would be important to ask, your local DNR fish folks or aquatic plant management folks, what the rules are for the lake, and what you need to do with that biomass.
Yeah, lots of great questions today. Doug, and I've seen this too, growing up in central Minnesota. Can you discuss the differences in management of floating mats of cattails
Yeah.
versus sediment rooted cattails? Is there, maybe you don't know the rules. Again, we might have to get our aquatic plant people on one of these days again, but
Yeah, I don't know the rules, but I know it's a big difference. I know it's complicated. So that was one of our challenges as well. We did not try to tackle, like very clearly did not try to tackle floating mats. We ran into trouble in our lot of sites because sometimes when water level changed, especially in Rainy Lake, what happens is it kind of lifts the cattail up. So what was once rooted became floating in the second year. So and of course, I think let me step back. One of the most effective things I think in my opinion so far is if you can handle cattail early in the invasion, you're better off because as it grows longer and those stands have been there longer, they do eventually kind of grow out and become their root system is so bound together that they can lift off and become floating. So it's an argument for getting at these cattail stands earlier than later, because there seems to be, and we don't have evidence of this yet, but there seems to be some time component that the longer the cattails are, the more likely you're going to end up with liftoff, right? And then it's going to start floating across your lake and cause huge problems, like navigational hazards. And of course, those cattail are then like, propagating themselves in some other part of the lake. So those floating mats are an issue. I believe it still requires permitting. So that would be something to talk to aquatic plant management about.
yeah,
And they're
yeah,
they're a
yeah,
bear to handle.
yeah, definitely follow up with our staff experts on that. Good question. You kind of touched on this, but what native species were commonly found or most commonly found growing in the reestablished areas
Oh,
that you cut?
that's a good question. I'm not gonna have a great list of names. I know we have things like water celery, water shield, a lot of lily pads, a lot of different pond weeds. So I am a fish person, so I am not great at identifying all my pond weeds, but different types of potamogeton. So pond weeds, I would say the floating leaf plants, things like water lilies and water shield. I don't know if we saw things like water celery. That's that sort of like single stem plant. So that's what we saw. A lot of floating leaf plants to start out with and pondweeds.
We have a couple of questions about, the control that you talked about and that the individual stocks can uh, drown basically, and then those sections of the plant will die. Is that correct? Or do they still potentially send out rhizomes? And so I guess folks are kind of
Yeah.
wondering about, do you need to worry about, those? And then the related question, is there any plants that can actually germinate through that root mass?
So good question. I think I I I know that if you cut the stem below the water and it doesn't regrow, I think it's more like you've suppressed the growth of that individual stem, right? Because if that stem, like in that picture I showed of Voyagers where it was really dry and we had the temperature loggers out, you could see some of those cut stems regrowing, like even in the fall. And that was growth from stems that had been cut. So if those cut stems become sort of unsubmerged or exposed to the air, they can grow again. So they're not really dead. They're more suppressed. And they stay suppressed if they stay underwater. As to whether that root right there shooting out a rhizome, I don't know the answer to that, but stems that are connected by that rhizome on the edge can. So when we saw regrowth in the places where, in some of our previous work, where always those stems were submerged, in a couple years you get a stem or two coming in from the side. So like if you had water all the time, you would probably just have to run around every spring and cut a few of those edge stems that have grown in from rhizomes. But if those cut stems stay submerged, they'll never grow. But if the water goes down and they become unsubmerged, you may have some regrowth from them stems. So they're not really dead, they're more suppressed. Kind of a long answer.
And
Does that make sense?
yeah.
Okay.
John asked, what are the best times for removal, or in this case, for the cutting that
Yeah,
you're
I
talking
think
about?
fall or winter. I think that's an easy time to do it. We've talked with Big Marine Park Reserve about removing over the ice, and actually one of our sites we were so late that we did some cattail removal over the ice. It had to be recut again in the spring. So I think fall, winter is your best bet. And it would be great if we could figure out how to do it over ice and then have that be
Or
suppressed in the spring. Yeah, under
the
ice would be
ice,
cool too
really,
if you could do
right?
that. Yeah, and there's some talk about trying to test out doing some burning over ice to see if, because that's sort of gets rid of that biomass that can be such a problem. So
And ideally after the mosquitoes are dead.
yeah, totally, totally.
They love cattails too. How extensive was native cattail mats compared to hybrid cattail mats in your areas? And I mean, I think this touches on some of the density issues that you talked a little bit about. Is that accurate to say some of the mats, the natives are not as big, right? Maybe because the growth is a lot less dense.
Yeah, and probably we don't have any native cattail in there. So native cattail really doesn't grow out into the lake like the hybrid does. So most of those mats you see are hybrid cattail. Native cattail doesn't grow in quite such deep water. It grows along the shore, but it doesn't grow out into deep water. So those cattail stands that we were in were likely all hybrid stands. You see native, if we had native cattail, it would have been just along the shore. So not really out into the sort of deeper water, but we had cattail out to 3 feet, 4 feet deep, and you would not have native cattail grow that deep. They're just not that tolerant of deep water. They'd only be along the shoreline. So we probably had none in the sites where we were sampling.
Okay. We have our poll done. Did you know about hybrid cattails? 29 of 117, so just over 30% said yes, and
Cool.
well, about half the people weren't able to answer, but a higher number said no. And folks are a lot more concerned about cattails now after hearing this, which is good to know.
Yep.
And again, a similar number of folks said they are aware of cattails taking over some of the local wetlands. So yeah, like 2 to 1, yes to no.
Okay. Wow.
So
Interesting.
it's
Yeah.
it's definitely an item of concern. Well,
Great.
we are out of time, folks. Thank you so much. We had a ton of great questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. There's a few that we couldn't even get to, but really thoughtful questions, and really appreciate all the great information that you provided, Amy. We can stop the recording, but I want to let folks know about next week. We have our annual deer season update. We'll be talking with our big game biologist